I carried his child for 9 months and prayed every single day that he would never find out. Not
He
because
would
he'd
never
want to be
find
a
out.
father, because he'd want to own us
Because he'd want
both.
to own us both.
Victoria Ashford's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles bone white against the dark leather. The Connecticut highway stretched ahead like a ribbon of escape, but her rear-view mirror told a different story. Behind her, the Cordova estate faded into the distance, all marble columns and manicured gardens that screamed old money louder than any voice ever could. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, each one a small rebellion against the man she'd just fled. 6 weeks. That's how much longer she could hide it. 6 weeks until her body would betray her, until the pregnancy became impossible to conceal. She'd made it this far by lying about a business trip, by keeping her doctor's appointments under a false name, by learning to move through the world like a ghost. But Dominic Cordova had built an empire on his ability to see things others missed. Things hidden. Things that belonged to him. The parking garage at Whitmore Academy smelled like oil and concrete. Victoria pulled into a space on the 3rd level, a location she'd chosen specifically because the security cameras had a blind spot there. She'd researched it for 3 weeks, marking her territory in preparation for this moment. The clock on the dashboard read 11:47 p.m. She killed the engine and sat in the darkness, letting the weight of what she was doing settle onto her shoulders like a physical thing. Before we start, make sure to hit like and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The graduation gala had been 4 months ago. She remembered the exact moment she saw him because it was the moment everything changed, though she didn't understand it yet. Dominic Cordova had walked into the ballroom like he owned the oxygen in the air. 28 years old, youngest executive at Cordova Capital, with a face that made people forget they had jobs to do. He wore a custom tuxedo, the color of charcoal, and his eyes, dark as slate, cold as winter, swept across the room until they landed on her. Victoria had been working as a junior analyst at his firm for 7 months. She was good at what she did. Numbers made sense to her in a way people never did. She could spot trends in data the way other women spotted lies in their boyfriends' eyes, but she wasn't prepared for Dominic Cordova to notice her. Girls like her, scholarship students who'd worked 3 jobs to make it through Whitmore Academy, who wore last season's designer knockoffs to company events, weren't usually on the radar of men like him. He'd asked her to dance. His hand on her waist had felt like a claim rather than an invitation. His cologne was expensive, something European that cost more per bottle than she made in a week. When he leaned close and whispered that she was different from the other women at the firm, something inside her had cracked open. Nobody had ever looked at her the way he did, like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. The pursuit had lasted exactly 93 days. She knew because she'd marked them on a calendar hidden in her closet. 93 days of expensive dinners at restaurants where she had to ask which fork to use. 93 days of gifts that appeared on her desk without explanation. First a silk scarf, then diamond earrings, then a credit card with no limit, and her name embossed in gold. He'd moved her into a penthouse overlooking the Hudson River. He'd isolated her from her friends with the precision of a surgeon using a scalpel. By day 80, she couldn't remember why she'd ever wanted to be independent. By day 93, she'd tried to leave. She'd walked into his office and told him she needed space. The words had felt foreign in her mouth, like she was reading lines from a script written by someone else. His response had been quiet. That's what made it terrifying. Not anger. Not raised voices, just ice-cold certainty delivered in a tone that made the temperature in the room drop by 20 degrees. "No one will hire you after I'm done," he'd said, not looking up from his laptop. "I'll make sure of it. One phone call, and every door in this industry closes. Your choice is simple, Victoria. Stay or disappear." She'd stayed. For 6 weeks, she'd stayed and smiled and performed the role of grateful girlfriend. And then she'd missed her period. The revelation had hit her during a morning meeting. She'd been presenting to a room full of investors, explaining a portfolio analysis, when her stomach had lurched with a certainty that made her hands shake. She'd excused herself, locked herself in a bathroom stall, and counted the days on her fingers. The numbers didn't lie. Victoria had always trusted numbers more than people, and they were telling her a story she wasn't prepared to hear. A baby. His baby. A human being who would tie her to Dominic Cordova for the rest of her life. That's when the planning had begun. Not the desperate, emotional kind of planning. The strategic kind. The kind a person used when they were playing chess with their own survival. She'd started small, documenting his threats on her phone, recording conversations where he made it clear that she belonged to him. She'd requested a transfer to the accounting department, a move that made him furious, but that gave her access to financial records. She'd opened a hidden bank account and started moving money into it, small amounts that wouldn't trigger alerts, but that added up over weeks into something significant. And then she'd done the thing that scared her most. She'd called a lawyer. The conversation had taken place in a bathroom stall at a mall 3 towns over, speaking in whispers between crying fits. The lawyer, a woman named Opal Chen with a voice like steel wrapped in velvet, had told her the truth. She had options, but they were all terrifying. Dominic had resources that made traditional routes of protection laughable. If she was going to escape, it had to be clean. It had to be smart. And it had to be soon, before her body told the world what she'd managed to keep secret. Now, sitting in her car, in the parking garage at 3 in the morning, Victoria pulled out her phone and opened a note she'd titled Everything. It contained the voice recordings, the screenshots of his messages, the documentation of his control. Insurance, she'd told herself. Leverage. The thing that would keep her and her child alive if everything else fell apart. She was about to start the car again when her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. 8 words that turned her blood to ice. "I know what you're planning. Let me help." What would you do if someone dangerous offered you a way out? Would you take it? Or would you trust your instincts and run? The phone screen glowed in the darkness, casting her face in shades of blue and white. Victoria stared at those 8 words until they blurred, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Unknown number. No caller ID, no context. Just someone, somewhere, claiming to know what lived inside her head, what she'd thought was safely hidden behind walls of secrecy and coded planning. Her hands shook as she typed a response. "Who is this?" The response came back in under 30 seconds. "Someone who's been watching. Someone who knows what he's doing to you. Delete this conversation after you read it. Then listen." An address followed. A warehouse in Newark, 5 miles away. The time, 4 a.m. Everything inside her screamed that this was a trap. Dominic had money. He had investigators. He had the kind of reach that made normal people look like children playing with toys they didn't understand. He could have hired someone to find her, to bring her back, to demonstrate what happened to people who tried to leave him. But underneath the fear, something else was happening. Something that felt almost like hope, though hope seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford. She drove to Newark with the windows down, even though the October wind was cold enough to make her teeth chatter. The warehouse was abandoned, the kind of place that had been empty for so long that time itself had stopped working there. No lights, no sound except the distant hum of the highway and the rapid hammering of her own heartbeat. She sat in the car for 10 minutes, watching for movement, for any sign that this was a setup. When he finally emerged from the shadows, she almost didn't recognize him. Silas Venn looked like Dominic the way a painting looks like a photograph, similar enough to be immediately recognizable, but wrong in ways that mattered. He had the same dark hair, the same aristocratic bone structure, but where Dominic was sharp and controlled, Silas seemed to carry some unseen weight that had softened him at the edges. He wore jeans and a leather jacket instead of a suit. His eyes were the same slate color, but they held something different. Kindness, maybe. Or possibly just a better understanding of how to pretend. "My name is Silas Venn," he said, keeping his distance, his hands visible to show he wasn't a threat. "And I know everything about what my brother has done to you." Victoria's mouth went dry. "Your brother?" "Dominic and I share the same father, and a good deal of blood that he'd like to pretend doesn't exist. We don't speak. Preferred that way, for both of us. But I have people who keep me informed about his business dealings, about his personal life, about the women he keeps." Silas moved slowly to the side of her car, as if he were approaching a wild animal that might bolt. "You're smart. Smarter than the others, I think. You've been documenting his behavior. You've been planning an escape. That shows intelligence. That shows you understand that staying would be a death of a different kind." "How did you—" Victoria started, but he held up his hand. "I know, because I've been exactly where you are. Not with him. With my father. The Cordova legacy is built on control, Victoria. On the ability to make people believe they can't survive without you. Dominic learned that lesson well." Silas pulled out a folder and set it on the hood of her car. Inside were photographs. Her at the doctor's office. Her opening the hidden bank account. Her meeting with Opal Chen. Her, captured in moments she'd thought were private, reduced to evidence in someone else's file. "You're pregnant. 7 weeks by my count. And Dominic doesn't know. When he finds out, and he will find out, he's going to use that baby as leverage. He'll take the child and use it to make sure you spend the rest of your life in a cage." The words hit her like a physical blow. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but they both knew better. They both understood that men like Dominic didn't believe in sharing. They believed in ownership. "What do you want?" Victoria whispered. "To help you. To give you something Dominic can never take away. Freedom. A new identity if you need it. Money. Protection. A safe place to have your baby, where he can never reach you." Silas pulled out a phone and set it next to the folder. "This is encrypted. This is how we'll communicate. I'm going to set you up with documents, a new apartment, everything you need. But you have to trust me. You have to be willing to disappear completely." "Why would you do this?" The question came out as barely more than a breath. "Because he destroyed my life. Because the only way to hurt a man like my brother is to take something he values. And because you deserve better." Silas turned to leave, then paused. "You have 72 hours before Dominic starts asking questions about where you are. 72 hours to get your affairs in order, to disappear. After that, everything changes. After that, there's no going back." The encrypted phone stayed with her through the night. By dawn, she'd made her decision. Silas had left her a set of instructions that read like a roadmap to a new life. A clinic in White Plains under a different name. Apartment leasing papers already prepared. A job offer at a nonprofit that didn't require background checks. He'd thought of everything. For the first time since the positive pregnancy test had turned her world inside out, Victoria felt something other than terror. She felt grateful. She sent Dominic a text from the penthouse the next morning. "I need space. I'm going to stay with my college roommate in Boston for a while." "I think we're moving too fast." His response had been immediate and cold. "We're not discussing this. Be home by 8. But Victoria was already loading her car by the time his message arrived. She'd taken only what she could carry. Clothes, the documentation, a single photograph of herself from before Dominic, when she still recognized the girl looking back at her. By noon, she was 3 hours away. By evening, she'd become someone new. Silas helped her sign the lease on a small apartment in a building that asked no questions and accepted cash. He brought her prenatal vitamins and books about pregnancy and labor. He came to her first ultrasound and held her hand when the doctor confirmed everything she already knew. That inside her was a living, breathing miracle who depended entirely on her survival. Over the following weeks, Silas became more than her savior. He became her family. The only person in the world who knew her secret and didn't judge her for it. 68 days after she'd fled, Victoria's water broke. The labor was 16 hours of pain that redefined what she thought her body was capable of enduring. But when it was over, when she held the result in her arms, a beautiful, dark-eyed boy with Dominic's features written all over his face, something shifted inside her chest. This was hers. This child was hers. And no matter what happened next, no matter what Dominic discovered or tried to do, she'd brought him into the world, and that meant something. "What will you name him?" Silas asked, holding the birth certificate with a pen poised above it, ready to write whatever she decided. Victoria looked at her son, at his perfect fingers, his dark eyes that already seemed far too wise, his small mouth already learning how to survive. "Owen," she said. "His name is Owen." "Owen Venn," Silas said, writing it down. "A fresh start. A new family." Victoria hadn't understood then that everything was about to change again. That the man who just saved her life was already planning to take away the one person in the world who made that life worth living. But the moment she signed those papers, the moment she let Silas's name replace the father's name on Owen's birth certificate, the first domino began its inevitable fall. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. Where was she supposed to go when her savior became her captor? 3 months. That's how long it took for everything to collapse. Owen was sleeping in the basement beside her bed when Silas walked into the apartment without knocking. His face had changed. The kindness that had seemed so genuine was gone, replaced by something sharp and calculating that Victoria realized she should have seen coming. She should have known that nobody that was helpful came without strings. Nobody in the real world offered salvation for free. "We need to talk about Owen's future," Silas said, his voice flat in a way that made her stomach drop. He closed the door behind him with deliberate slowness. "About what happens next." Victoria's arms went around her son instinctively, pulling him closer as he slept, unaware that the world was about to shatter for the second time in his short life. "What do you mean?" "Everything is fine. Owen is safe. I'm safe. We have a plan." "Yes, we do. But it's not the plan you think it is." Silas moved to the window and looked out at the city below, his silhouette framed against the afternoon light. Do you know why my father cut me off? Why Dominic and I haven't spoken in a decade? It's because I threatened him. I told him that if he didn't give me control of the family business, I'd expose every illegal thing he'd ever done. Every bribe, every threat, every woman he'd destroyed. He laughed at me. He told me I didn't have the spine to follow through. He turned to face her, and Victoria saw the real truth in his eyes. This wasn't about helping her. It had never been about that. But I did follow through. I walked away. I built my own empire to prove I didn't need his money, his name, or his approval. And still, it wasn't enough. He won by ignoring me. He took away the power of my revenge by making me irrelevant. Silas moved closer to the bassinet, and Victoria's entire body went rigid. Until now. Until I found you. Silas, please. Her voice came out small and broken. He can't have him. Dominic will hurt him. You know what he's like. You know. I know exactly what he's like. And I don't care. Because Owen isn't going to be hurt. Owen is going to be the weapon that destroys him. Silas pulled out a set of legal documents. You're going to sign these. They transfer guardianship to me if anything happens to you. They make me the primary decision-maker in Owen's life. They give me custody in case of emergency. And then you're going to disappear. No. Victoria held her son tighter, her entire body shaking. No, I won't let you take him. I'll call the police. I'll tell them what you're planning. And tell them what exactly? That a man who has no legal relationship to you and Owen suddenly showed up, and you're accusing him of crimes he hasn't committed yet? Silas sat down across from her, completely calm, completely certain. I have documentation of Dominic's abuse. I have evidence of his control. I have your own recordings where you confirm everything. When I take Owen through the courts, I'll look like a hero. I'll look like the good brother who rescued a child from a monster. And you, Victoria? You'll look unstable, desperate, the kind of mother who can't be trusted with her own son. The words landed with the precision of someone who'd already played this game in his head 1,000 times. Victoria realized with crushing clarity that he had. He'd been planning this the entire time. Every kind gesture had been currency. Every moment of support had been an investment in this exact moment. Please, she tried again, but the word was meaningless. She could see the calculation in his face, the way he'd already decided how this would end. He's your nephew. How can you use him like this? Family is a tool, Victoria. Nothing more, nothing less. My father taught me that. Dominic perfected it. I'm simply finishing what they started. Silas gestured to the documents. Sign them, or I'll take him anyway. I have the resources to make it stick. You'll spend the rest of your life in court, watching your son grow up with me while you fight for supervised visits. Or you can sign these papers, walk away, and let me do what needs to be done. Victoria's hands shook so badly she could barely hold the pen, but she signed. She signed because she was tired, because she was alone, because she understood that she'd traded one predator for another and lost the ability to protect her son in the process. She signed because mothers sometimes have to make impossible choices, and there was no choice here that didn't end in devastation. After Silas left, she held Owen for hours. She breathed in his baby's smell, memorized the way his fingers wrapped around her thumb, tried to burn into her memory every detail of who he was and how much she loved him. Because she knew, with the certainty of someone who'd already learned how the world worked, that this was goodbye. What happens when the only person you trust turns out to be just another version of the man you fled. 6 months into his life, Owen had learned to smile. Victoria watched him from across the living room, studying the way his face transformed when he was happy. His eyes crinkled, his mouth opened wide. His whole body seemed to light up from the inside, and for moments like these, she could almost forget that her life had become a series of supervised moments stolen like contraband. 2 hours on Wednesdays, 3 hours on Saturdays. Sometimes 4 if Silas was in a good mood. Always with him watching, always with the understanding that Owen's affection belonged to him now, and she was just a visitor in her son's life. Silas had moved Owen into the master bedroom of his penthouse. It was decorated like a nursery from a magazine, expensive furniture, designer bedding. Everything a child could possibly need, except for the thing he actually needed, which was his mother. But Silas brought her to see him regularly. He wanted her to watch. He wanted her to understand exactly what she'd lost and what he'd gained. He wanted her gratitude for the scraps of time he allowed her. "You should move on," he'd told her last month, his voice carrying that fake concern that had fooled her before. "Find another man. Build a different life. Owen needs stability, and your constant presence reminds him of chaos." The cruelty of it was that he was probably right. Children adapted. Children moved on. Within 6 months, Owen had begun to cry when she picked him up, resistant to her touch. Reaching instead for Silas, with the unconscious trust of an infant who understood that this man was the constant in his world, and she was the disruption. She'd tried to fight it. She'd hired lawyers, used the money Silas had given her, blood money she now understood, payment for her cooperation in her own destruction. But Silas's lawyers were better. His resources were deeper. The documentation he'd collected about her instability, her desperation, her emotional volatility, painted her as exactly the kind of mother who shouldn't be trusted with a child. The judge had sided with him within weeks. Now Victoria worked at a nonprofit downtown, spending her days helping women escape domestic abuse situations, and every story reminded her that she'd failed to escape on her own. She'd simply traded one cage for another, at least with Dominic. The control had been honest. At least he'd never pretended to be a savior while stealing her son. But today, something was different. Silas had called her, his voice carrying undertones of something other than his usual cold certainty. He'd asked her to come to the penthouse during an unusual time, a Tuesday afternoon instead of her scheduled Wednesday. He'd been vague about why, and Victoria's instincts, the ones that had kept her alive this far, had screamed warnings. But she'd gone anyway, because he'd asked her to see Owen, and she couldn't refuse that. The penthouse smelled like expensive cologne, and something else she couldn't identify. Underneath that was the scent of her son, the particular smell of baby skin, and the specific lotions Silas used on him. She found them in the nursery. Owen playing with wooden blocks under his nanny's supervision, his movements becoming more coordinated, more deliberate, less dependent on instinct. When he saw Victoria, he froze. For a moment, just a moment, she saw recognition in his dark eyes. He remembered her. The connection wasn't broken. It was just buried under months of Silas's careful reshaping, teaching Owen to think of this man as his real parent. "Owen," Victoria whispered, kneeling down. "Hi, baby. It's Mama." Owen's face scrunched up. He turned to look at the nanny, as if checking whether this stranger was a threat or a treat. The nanny nodded encouragement, and Owen toddled toward Victoria with the unsteady confidence of a child who was learning to trust his legs more than anything else. He patted her face with small, wet hands. His fingers found her eyes, her nose. her mouth. He was remembering her through touch. "I need to tell you something," Silas said from the doorway. His voice had lost some of its coldness, replaced by something that sounded almost like regret. Almost, but not quite. "I've decided that this arrangement has gone as far as it can go." Victoria froze, her hand stilling on Owen's small body. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm filing for full legal custody. It means your supervised visits are going to end. It means Owen will grow up knowing me as his father, and you as—" He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air between them like poison gas. "Well, we'll let him decide what you are to him. Maybe nothing. Maybe a nice woman who visits sometimes. A memory he'll eventually forget." "You can't do this." Victoria pulled Owen closer, though she knew it was futile. Silas had already done this. He'd been doing it all along. "He's my son. He's leveraged. Leverage I've been using very effectively against my brother. Did you know Dominic has been investigating what happened to you? Did you know he's been searching for Owen for the past 6 months? He knows the child exists. He knows it's his, and he's been trying to find us." Silas's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "I've been letting him search. I've been leaving breadcrumbs for his investigators to follow. And very soon, when he finally tracks Owen down, he's going to see that his son is being raised by the one person in the world he hates most. That his son calls someone else father. That he's lost everything before he even knew he had it." Victoria understood then. With the clarity of someone who'd already learned how to read the language of cruelty, that Silas had never been trying to save Owen from his father. He'd been using Owen as a weapon against his father all along. And she'd helped him do it. She'd signed the papers. She'd stayed silent. She'd let love make her weak and complicit in her own son's theft. "What happens to me now?" she asked quietly. "You disappear. You stay away from Owen. You let me win. And if you're lucky, if you're very lucky, maybe Dominic won't find you first. Maybe he won't realize that the woman who gave birth to his son is still alive and desperate and worth destroying." Silas turned toward the door. "Our visits are finished, Victoria. Take a good look at him. This is your last time with your son." But Victoria didn't look at Owen. Instead, she looked directly at Silas, and she made a decision that would change everything. She would tell Dominic everything, not to protect herself, not to win some custody battle she'd already lost, but because her son needed to know that there were men in the world who didn't use love as a weapon. And because even monsters, even men like Dominic Cordova, deserved to know they had a child. And because the only thing more terrifying than living in a cage with a predator was living outside it, knowing that your son was inside one. She had no idea that Dominic was already looking. She had no idea that he'd been searching for 6 months, following leads, hiring investigators, burning through resources with the single-minded focus of a man who'd just discovered he had something to lose. She had no idea that her decision to tell him was about to collide with his determination to find Owen, and that collision was going to blow everything apart. But when the call came 3 days later, when a lawyer told her that Dominic Cordova had filed for custody and that the courts were ordering her to testify about what she knew, Victoria finally began to understand that sometimes your enemy is the only person who can save you, and sometimes salvation comes wrapped in the face of the man you were trying to escape. The courthouse hallways smelled like floor wax and broken promises. Victoria sat on the wooden bench outside the family court, her hands folded in her lap to stop them from shaking. Her lawyer, Opal Chen, sat beside her reviewing documents with the focused intensity of someone preparing for war. Across the hallway, sitting with a team of attorneys that cost more per hour than Victoria made in a month, was Dominic Cordova. He looked exactly like he had the night of the graduation gala. Expensive, controlled, dangerous. But his eyes were different now. They held something she'd never seen before. They held the knowledge that he had something to lose. "He's going to try to paint you as unstable," Opal whispered, not looking up from the papers. "He's going to use Silas's documentation against you. He's going to make the case that you willingly gave your son to another man, and therefore you're unfit. I need you to stay calm. I need you to remember that Dominic Cordova has already proven he's not a safe parent. That's his weakness. We exploit that." But Victoria wasn't thinking about strategy. She was thinking about the text message she'd received that morning from a number she didn't recognize. "Don't be afraid. I have this." The message had come from one of Dominic's lawyers. She understood what it meant, even without him explaining it. Dominic was going to destroy Silas, and she was going to help him do it, whether she wanted to or not. The judge called them in. The courtroom was smaller than Victoria expected, more intimate. The judge was a woman in her 60s with gray hair and the kind of tired eyes that came from seeing too much human damage. Silas sat across from Dominic, his expensive suit and polished appearance designed to convince the judge that he was the kind of man who could provide stability. Victoria saw the calculation in every gesture, every word. This was a performance. All of it was performance. "Let's start with the custody arrangement you established," the judge said, looking at the documents in front of her. "Mr. Venn, you filed for guardianship based on the mother's emotional instability and your desire to protect the child. Can you explain the basis for that claim?" Silas launched into a carefully prepared narrative. He talked about Victoria's documented anxiety, her inability to hold a job, her desperation that made her unreliable. He made her sound like a broken person, which, Victoria supposed, was at least partially true. He didn't mention the lies he'd told. He didn't mention the way he'd manipulated her into signing documents she didn't understand. He didn't mention that every allegation he made was technically accurate, only because he'd created the circumstances that made them true. Then it was her turn. Victoria sat in the witness chair, and the room seemed to tilt slightly. Dominic was watching her with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. His lawyer stood up and began her questions with gentle precision. "Ms. Ashford, is it true that you consented to allowing Mr. Venn to become the primary guardian for Owen?" Victoria wanted to lie. She wanted to say that Silas had forced her, that she'd had no choice, but Opal had coached her well. The truth was more powerful than any lie she could construct. "Yes, I signed documents that gave him guardianship, but I need to explain the circumstances. Just answer the question yes or no, please. You consented to this arrangement?" "Yes." "And after signing this arrangement, you maintained sporadic contact with your son? Visitation every few weeks?" "Yes. But Mr. Venn was—" "Did you initiate contact with Mr. Cordova to tell him about the child?" This was the question Opal had warned her about. This was the moment where Victoria had to decide whether to tell the truth or protect herself. "No," she said quietly. "Mr. Cordova learned about Owen through his own investigations." Silas's lawyer stood up now, and Victoria could see the shift. She could see the moment when they realized they'd lost control of the narrative. "Ms. Ashford, I want to show you these documents. These are the guardianship papers you signed. Can you explain what you were told about them?" Victoria looked at the papers, at her own signature written in her careful hand. I was told they were precautions, that they would protect Owen and me from Dominic's attempts to control us. And yet, you've testified that Dominic initiated contact, that he began investigations into the child's existence without your knowledge. So these precautions were already in place before there was any threat? The implication hung in the air like a weapon. Silas had prepared the guardianship papers months before Dominic even knew Owen existed. The documents Victoria had signed hadn't been protected. They'd been a theft, a methodical, calculated theft of a child that had nothing to do with protecting anyone and everything to do with using that child as a weapon against his father. Dominic's lawyer pressed harder. "Ms. Ashford, when did you first tell Mr. Venn about the pregnancy?" "Shortly after he found me in the parking garage, within a week of meeting him." "And when did he tell you his plan for the child?" "After Owen was born, when he revealed that he'd named himself on the birth certificate as the father." "So, you're testifying that Mr. Venn's entire assistance to you, the shelter, the money, the protection, was contingent on you allowing him to take your son?" "Objection!" Silas's lawyer shot out, but the judge overruled it. She was leaning forward now, her tired eyes suddenly very sharp. "I'm testifying," Victoria said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her chest, "that I was manipulated by someone I believed was helping me, that I made decisions out of desperation and fear, and that I signed away my rights to my son so that a man could use him as leverage in a decades-old family dispute." The courtroom went silent. Silas's face had gone pale. His lawyer was whispering frantically to him, but he wasn't listening. He was looking at Victoria with an expression that was almost surprising, as if he'd genuinely believed she'd always remain complicit in her own destruction. The judge looked at Dominic. "Mr. Cordova, I've reviewed your evidence of paternity. You're certainly the biological father. The question before me is, what custody arrangement best serves the child's interests?" Dominic stood up. His lawyer tried to pull him back down, but he ignored her. He walked to the center of the courtroom and addressed the judge directly, his voice carrying the same cold certainty that had made Victoria afraid of him years ago. "I'm not a good father," he said. "I don't know how to be. I have a history of control and manipulation. I used this woman." He gestured to Victoria. "I isolated her. I threatened her. I took away her choices. I'm the same kind of man my father was and my brother became, just with better manners. But I will not allow my child to be raised by someone who'd use him as a weapon. Even if I'm a weapon myself, my son will never be used the way Silas intends to use him." "Mr. Cordova, do you have a proposal for custody?" the judge asked, clearly intrigued by this unusual honesty. "Joint custody with Victoria Ashford. I'll provide financial support and housing. I'll ensure Owen knows his mother. And I'll put my entire legal team at work, proving that Silas Venn is unfit to have any access to this child." Silas stood up, his face flushed with rage. "You can't do this. I'll fight it. I'll take it to appeals. "You'll what, Mr. Venn?" the judge said coldly. "Use this child further? You've admitted in your own documentation that this guardianship was designed to hurt your brother. That makes you exactly the kind of parent this court works to prevent. I'm ordering temporary custody of Ms. Ashford and Mr. Cordova, pending a full investigation into your conduct." What Victoria didn't understand then, sitting in that courtroom while Silas's face turned the color of rage, was that she'd just made a deal with a different kind of devil. She'd traded one captor for another. She'd walked out of the courthouse with her son, finally, after months of supervised visits and stolen moments, and right into the penthouse of the man she'd fled 3 years ago. She had no idea that Dominic had spent the past 6 months investigating her life, that he'd seen her work at the nonprofit, that he'd read her journal when he thought she was asleep, that he'd fallen in love with the person he'd broken, and now he was about to do something even more dangerous than he'd ever done before. He was going to try to fix what he'd destroyed, and Victoria, exhausted and broken and desperate to get her son back, was going to let him. Her heart had stopped beating. Actually stopped. The monitors were screaming about it in a language Victoria didn't understand, but the numbers on the screens told the story her body already knew. 12 minutes. That's what the paramedics had said in the ambulance, their voices clipped and professional as they pushed medications through her IV and compressed her chest with mechanical precision. 12 minutes to get authorization for the experimental treatment that might save her life. 12 minutes before the window closed, and she became just another victim of a system that didn't know how to fix what was broken inside her. The studio apartment was cold. It was always cold, even in October, because the landlord refused to turn on the heat until November. Victoria had been lying on the kitchen floor when her body betrayed her, when the pain in her chest turned into something that made her vision darken at the edges. She'd called 911 with fingers that wouldn't obey her commands, speaking words that came out fragmented and wrong. The dispatcher had asked her questions she couldn't answer. Her mind was already leaving her body behind, already preparing for whatever came next. The hospital smelled like every hospital everywhere. That mixture of antiseptic and fear, and the particular scent of people who were dying in the most ordinary ways imaginable. Victoria had been admitted with a diagnosis the doctors said 3 times before she understood it: postpartum cardiomyopathy. Her heart was failing. The pregnancy had damaged the muscle, and her years of stress and trauma and living in a constant state of fight or flight had accelerated the damage. She was 26 years old, and her body was giving up. The ER doctor, a black woman with box braids pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that had seen too much tragedy, leaned over her with papers in her hands. "We can try an experimental treatment. It's designed for cases like yours, but we need authorization from your medical power of attorney." Medical power of attorney. The words meant nothing at first, and then they meant everything. Silas. She'd given Silas power of attorney over her medical decisions months ago, back when she still believed he was the kind of person who deserved trust, back when she thought his love was real instead of just another form of control. "Call him," Victoria whispered, each word requiring more effort than she had available. "His number is in my phone." The nurse made the calls. First to Silas's office, where they were told he was unavailable. Then to his home, where his assistant said he was traveling. Then to his cell phone, which rang and rang into an empty void. Silas Venn, the man who claimed to have built his empire on protecting people, was unreachable. Deliberately, it would turn out later. He was on a boat in the Mediterranean, disconnected from the world, unable to be contacted by anyone, including the hospital trying to save the life of the woman he'd used and discarded. 8 minutes passed. The doctor came back with more papers. "I'm very sorry, but without authorization—" "There has to be another way," Victoria said, though her voice was barely audible now. Her body was shutting down, pulling power from her limbs to keep her vital organs functioning. This was what dying felt like. Not dramatic or painful anymore. Just a slow fade into darkness. 12 minutes. That's what they'd promised. 12 minutes to get authorization before the treatment window closes permanently. The nurse looked at the paperwork in her hands. There's one other person we can try. The biological father. If he can be located, no. Victoria's eyes snapped open with something that wasn't quite strength, but was close enough. Don't call him. I don't want... But the nurse was already moving, already making calls, already putting Victoria's life in the hands of the man she'd spent years trying to escape. She heard the conversation happening at the edge of her consciousness. Medical personnel with urgent voices finding a contact number, reaching out to a lawyer, leaving a message that said, "Medical emergency. The patient requested we contact Dominic Cordova. Time-sensitive authorization needed." 9 minutes. Victoria's vision was dimming. The hospital room was turning into something watercolor and distant, all the sharp edges bleeding into soft shapes. She could hear the monitors still screaming their electronic warnings. She could hear nurses moving around her, preparing equipment, preparing for either a rescue or a funeral. She couldn't tell which. The phone rang in the ER. The nurse answered, and Victoria heard the words that changed everything. "Mr. Cordova, thank you for picking up on such short notice. We have a patient, Victoria Ashford, in critical condition with postpartum cardiomyopathy. We need immediate authorization." What would you do if the one person you were running from became the only person who could save your life? 10 minutes. The clock was ticking toward a future Victoria wasn't sure she wanted to see. And Dominic Cordova was on the other end of the phone, making a choice that would define everything that came after. The black SUV ran 3 red lights on the way to the hospital. Dominic Cordova sat in the back seat, phone pressed to his ear, his legal team scrambling to do the impossible in real time. His lawyer, Nathan Cross, was on speaker, talking fast enough that his words blurred together into one continuous stream of urgency. "We can get a temporary emergency order," Nathan was saying. "Revoke Silas's power of attorney and grant it to you. But we need a judge, and we need them in the next 8 minutes." "Make it happen," Dominic said, his voice carrying the same cold certainty that had built his empire. "I don't care what it costs. I don't care who you have to call. The woman in that hospital is the mother of my child, and she's not dying because my brother is playing games on a boat." The driver pushed the SUV faster. Dominic watched the city blur past the windows, watched the world move at a speed that suddenly seemed too slow. He'd spent 6 months looking for Victoria. 6 months of investigators and databases and following threads that led him through her new life. Her job at a nonprofit. Her apartment in a neighborhood he could have bought and raised in an afternoon if he'd wanted to. He'd watched her from a distance, learning who she'd become when he wasn't there to control her. She was stronger, harder. Her art, because he'd discovered she'd been painting, leaving sketches on her apartment walls like evidence of an inner life she'd kept hidden from him, showed someone with depth he'd never bothered to look for when they were together. She'd survived leaving him. More than that, she'd thrived. And he'd realized, with the clarity that came only when something mattered more than the empire he'd built, that he wanted to know this version of her. Not the broken version he'd created, but the one who'd learned to survive his damage. The hospital entrance loomed. Dominic was out of the car before it fully stopped, taking the steps 3 at a time, his expensive suit jacket flying behind him like a cape. At the front desk, he said her name, and the nurse's expression shifted. She knew who he was. Of course she knew. His face had been in the business section of the Times that morning. Billionaire. Dangerous. The kind of man hospitals had protocols for. She's in critical care. You can't see her without... But Dominic was already past her, already moving down hallways that all looked identical, already following the sound of monitors screaming warnings. Nathan's voice was still in his ear. "You're granted temporary power of attorney pending full court review. You can authorize the treatment. Repeat, you are authorized." He found her room. Found her. Victoria looked like a ghost of herself, pale and small on the hospital bed, tubes running from her arms, her chest rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed fragile as paper. This was the woman he'd loved by controlling her. This was the woman he'd lost by breaking her. This was the woman who'd given him a son he didn't know he had, and then spent years protecting that son from him. The doctor looked up. "Are you the father?" "Yes." The word came out raw. "We have authorization from your legal team. We can proceed with the treatment. It's experimental, and the results aren't guaranteed. But without it, we're looking at about 90 minutes before her condition becomes irreversible." Dominic nodded, but he didn't look away from Victoria. Her eyes were barely open, her gaze unfocused. She didn't seem to see him. Or maybe she did, and couldn't believe he was real, appearing like a ghost in her final moments, the man she'd fled and fought against and tried to keep out of her son's life. "Do it," he said. "Do whatever it takes." The medical team moved with sudden urgency. They inserted a new IV line, pushed medication that made Victoria's body convulse slightly, and then the room fell into a different kind of silence. The silence of waiting. The silence of people who'd done everything they could and were now dependent on forces beyond their control. Dominic pulled a chair beside her bed and sat down. He watched her breathing. He watched the monitors that showed her heart struggling to remember how to beat correctly. He thought about the 6 months of investigation that had led him here, the investigators who'd reported back about a woman working at a nonprofit, living modestly, visiting a child in Silas's penthouse every few weeks until the visits stopped. The photographs they'd gathered showed her getting thinner, smaller, like she was disappearing by degrees. He'd had the power to reach out to her. He'd had the resources to pull her back into his orbit at any moment. But he'd spent 6 months watching her from the shadows, learning that the damage he'd done was deeper than he'd realized, understanding that his control had nearly destroyed her. And then she'd called him, or rather, she'd told a hospital to call him. She'd chosen him in the moment when it mattered most, and he would never stop wondering if it was because there was no one else, or because on some level, she'd known he would be the one who'd answer. The medication worked. Victoria's heart steadied. The monitors that had been screaming found a rhythm, irregular but present, fighting but functional. The doctor came back with a new expression. Not quite relief, but something closer to hope. "We're not out of danger," she said, "but she's stabilizing. The next 48 hours will be critical. But if she makes it through those, the prognosis gets significantly better." Dominic let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He reached out and took Victoria's hand carefully, afraid that even his touch might be too much for her fragile body. Her fingers didn't respond. But they didn't pull away either. Hours passed. The hospital room became his world. Nurses came and went. Monitors beeped their steady songs. And Victoria slept, while machines did the work her body couldn't manage on its own. By 3 a.m., the immediate crisis had passed. Dominic was still sitting beside her, still holding her hand, when her eyes began to flutter open. When she finally focused on his face, when comprehension replaced confusion, Dominic saw her entire body go rigid. She tried to speak, but her throat was too damaged from the tubes they'd placed in it during the emergency. She made a sound that might have been his name, or might have been fear, and Dominic leaned closer. "Don't try to talk," he said quietly. "You're safe. You're in the hospital. Your heart stopped, but we got authorization for the treatment. You're stable now." her eyes filled with tears. She was crying without sound, her body shaking with the weight of emotions she couldn't express. Dominic watched her process the fact that he was there, that he'd been there while she was dying, that the man she'd spent years running from had been the one to answer the call. He didn't let go of her hand. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter, where Victoria will have to face the man who broke her and discover whether redemption is possible between two people who've already destroyed each other. What did Dominic do while she was unconscious? What did he discover about himself sitting in that hospital room watching her fight for every breath? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And share this story with someone who needs to know that sometimes the person you're running from becomes the person you need most. Victoria's voice came back in pieces. By the second day, she could whisper single words. By the third day, she could manage short sentences, though speaking felt like swallowing broken glass. Dominic was there for all of it. He'd moved into the hospital with the kind of single-minded focus that had made him a billionaire, redirected toward ensuring that she had everything she needed to heal. He brought her favorite flowers, pale pink peonies that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He brought art supplies, even though her hands were too weak to hold a paintbrush. He brought books and read to her, his voice filling the sterile hospital room with stories that had nothing to do with their past and everything to do with trying to create a present where they could breathe near each other without drowning. "Owen," Victoria whispered on the fourth day, panic threading through her weak voice. "Where is Owen? Is he safe? Did Silas—" "Owen is with my house staff in Connecticut," Dominic said calmly, pulling the chair closer. "He's being cared for by people who've been vetted and backgrounded. He's eating well, he's sleeping well, and he's asking about his mother." Victoria's eyes closed. Tears slid down her cheeks without the drama of sobs, just a quiet expression of grief and relief mixing together into something she didn't have the strength to process fully. "I never wanted to leave him," she whispered. "I was trying to protect him. I was trying to keep him from becoming what I became, a possession, a thing to be owned." Dominic was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that seemed to cost him significant effort. "I know." It was the beginning of honesty between them. Not apology. Dominic wasn't the type of man who apologized easily. Not forgiveness. Victoria wasn't ready to offer that yet. But something like understanding. Something like the mutual acknowledgement that they'd both survived something terrible and come out the other side changed. "I have to tell you something," Dominic said on the fifth day, when Victoria was sitting up in bed, her color finally starting to return. "And you need to listen to all of it before you respond." Victoria's entire body went tense. "I found you 6 months ago. I had investigators track you to the nonprofit, to your apartment, to your life. I watched you. I know about the paintings. I know about the women you help who are in situations similar to what you were in. I know about the money you save and the way you've rebuilt yourself." He stood up and moved to the window, not looking at her. "And I fell in love with who you became when I wasn't destroying you. That terrified me. It still does." Victoria couldn't find words. Her mind was reeling with the implication that he'd been watching her, following her, keeping tabs on her life. The old Dominic had done those things too, but for different reasons. "I didn't reach out because you deserved to stay gone. You deserved to live a life where I wasn't the gravitational force pulling you off balance. But I couldn't stop watching. I couldn't stop knowing." He turned to face her. "And when the hospital called and said your name, when I understood that you were dying and that the only thing standing between your life and death was authorization from a man who was deliberately unreachable. I finally understood what my power was actually for. "What?" Victoria asked, her voice barely audible. "To help. Not to control. Not to own. To actually help someone I cared about survive." He sat back down in the chair beside her bed. "I know what I did to you. I know what I put you through. I know that my presence in your life was a cage. But Victoria, Owen exists because of what happened between us. And Owen is the best thing I've ever been responsible for creating. If you'll let me, I want to be a better man for him. For you." Victoria stared at him. She could see the sincerity in his face, but she could also see the calculation. That was the thing about men like Dominic. They didn't stop being strategic just because they wanted you to believe they had. They simply redirected their strategy toward different goals. "If I say no," she asked quietly, "what happens?" "I walk away. I provide support for Owen financially. I don't interfere with your life. I disappeared the way you wanted me to disappear when you first ran. And if I say yes, we figured it out. You and me and Owen and whatever comes next. No promises that we'll get it right. No promises that I won't revert to old patterns sometimes. But promises that I'll try. Promises that I'll do better." Victoria looked away from him, looked out the window at the city beyond the hospital walls, at the world that had moved on while she was dying and being saved, and trying to understand how the man who'd nearly destroyed her had become the man who couldn't stop saving her. "I need to think about it," she said finally. But even as she said it, she knew the truth. She'd already made her choice. She'd made it the moment she told the hospital to call him. She'd made it 6 months ago when she'd decided to expose Silas rather than protect herself. She'd made it years ago when she'd decided that her son's life was worth more than her own comfort. She was going to give him a chance. And they both knew it. What does it mean when the person who broke you becomes the person trying to fix you? Can love ever survive being weaponized the way theirs had? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story about second chances and the complicated redemption that comes when we choose to love people we should probably hate. The penthouse in Manhattan was different than the one Victoria remembered. Dominic had changed it. The stark minimalism that had screamed wealth without warmth had been softened with art and color. Real art, not the kind chosen by interior decorators, but the kind someone actually cared about. Victoria recognized one of the pieces immediately. It was a painting she'd done years ago, before Dominic, before the world had taught her to be afraid. Owen didn't recognize her at first. That was the hardest part. He was nearly 2 years old now, walking with the confident uncertainty of a child learning to trust his own feet. Dominic had brought him to the penthouse an hour after Victoria arrived, freshly bathed and dressed in expensive clothing that looked uncomfortable on his small frame. "Mama," Dominic said gently, pointing to Victoria. "This is your mama." Owen looked suspicious. He'd been raised by nannies, and Dominic, and the slow influence of a man trying to prove he could be something other than what he'd always been. When Victoria knelt down and extended her hand, Owen hid behind Dominic's leg. The rejection hit her like a physical blow. She'd known it was coming. She'd prepared herself for it. But nothing really prepared you for the moment when your own child didn't recognize you. "It's okay," Dominic said softly, and there was something in his voice that suggested he'd braced himself for this too. "We'll take time. He's young. He'll remember you." But Owen didn't remember her immediately. It took 3 days of Dominic bringing him to the penthouse, 3 days of Victoria reading him books and singing songs off-key and playing with blocks, while he watched her with careful eyes. And then, on the fourth day, something shifted. Owen reached for her instead of for Dominic. Owen called her Mama, with the same natural certainty he had for everything else. Victoria held her son and cried. The days fell into a rhythm that should have felt impossible. She lived in Dominic's penthouse, but had her own suite of rooms. She spent mornings with Owen, afternoons recovering her strength with the physical therapist Dominic had hired. In the evenings, after Owen was asleep, she and Dominic would sit on the balcony overlooking the city and talk about nothing important. Music, architecture, the way light changed at different times of day. He never pushed. He was patient in a way she'd never expected him to be capable of. And slowly, as the weeks turned into months, something began to change between them. Not the dramatic rush of attraction that had fooled her the first time. Something deeper. Something that felt less like passion and more like recognition. "I'm resuming work with the nonprofit," Victoria told him 3 months after she left the hospital. "I'm writing a manual for women who are trying to escape. My story. Other stories. Resources." Dominic nodded. "I know. I've been funding it. Anonymously. In case you wanted nothing to do with my money." Victoria wanted to be angry about that, about the fact that he was still inserting himself into her decisions, still trying to control her trajectory. But she also understood what he was really saying. He was supporting her independence because he'd learned that it mattered to her more than any luxury he could provide. "Thank you," she said finally. "You're rebuilding your life," he said. "The least I can do is make sure you have the resources to do it on your terms." Owen started attending a preschool that cost more per semester than most people made in a year. Dominic took him on the first day, while Victoria watched from outside, seeing her son walk into a room full of children his own age, without a backward glance. He'd become confident. He'd become the kind of child who believed the world would catch him if he fell. At night, after Owen was asleep, Victoria and Dominic would sit in the living room and she would paint. He would read or work on his laptop, but mostly he would watch her create, watching the transformation of blank canvas into something with color and shape and meaning. He never commented on what she painted. He simply bore witness to her becoming. One evening, as she was cleaning her brushes, he asked, "Do you forgive me?" Victoria thought about the question. She thought about all the things he'd done to her, all the control and manipulation and fear. She thought about the fact that his redemption didn't erase what he'd broken, didn't undo the damage, didn't make the past year of her life suddenly become okay. But she also thought about the man sitting across from her, who'd learned to love his son instead of own him, who'd learned to support Victoria instead of control her, who'd learned, in his own way, to be human. "I'm learning too," she said finally. "Is that enough?" "It has to be," Dominic replied. "Because it's the best I can offer." 3 months later, Dominic took her back to the nonprofit. He walked with her to the art studio she'd set up in the back, where women who'd escaped abuse could come to express what they couldn't say in words. He watched her teach a class on how to channel rage into creation. He watched her change lives because she understood, intimately, what it meant to be broken, and then have to rebuild yourself from the pieces. When they left the nonprofit that evening, he took her hand for the first time since the hospital. His palm was warm against hers. His grip was gentle, asking rather than demanding. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because I want to own you, but because I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I'm becoming someone worthy of you." Victoria looked at him. The man who'd started as a nightmare had become complicated. He'd become real. He'd become someone she could actually choose, not because he'd forced her hand, but because she wanted to. "Ask me again in 6 months," she said, "after I finish my book. After I've rebuilt more than just my own life." He smiled. It was a real smile, not the calculated thing he'd used on her in the beginning. It was a smile that suggested he understood. It was a smile that suggested he was willing to wait as long as she needed. Subscribe now and turn on all notifications because the final chapter is coming, and it will change everything you thought you understood about second chances and what happens when love gets a chance to rewrite itself into something real. What do you think Victoria will say when he asks her again? Drop your predictions in the comments and tell us whether you believe people can truly change or whether some damage is too deep to repair. Your stories matter. Share this with someone who needs to hear that redemption isn't easy, but it might be possible. 6 months later, Victoria stood in front of a mirror wearing a dress that wasn't white and wasn't meant to pretend she was something she'd never been. It was gold, the color of sunset, the color of transformation. Her mother was adjusting the hem while Owen sat on the bed, playing with his father's cufflinks, completely unconcerned with the momentousness of what was about to happen. The book had been published. 32 women's stories, including her own. Profiles of redemption and recovery, and the complicated journey of learning to trust yourself again after someone had spent months teaching you that your instincts were dangerous. The nonprofit had received 10,000 new volunteers wanting to help. The waiting list for the art studio was 3 months long. Victoria had rebuilt herself. Not back to who she'd been before Dominic. That girl was gone, hopefully for good. But into something stronger. Someone who understood her own capacity for survival and her own need for connection. Someone who could walk into a room and claim space without apologizing for it. The wedding was small, just family. Dominic's distant relatives who'd been shocked by his transformation, Victoria's mother who'd cried through the entire ceremony, and most importantly, Owen, who'd insisted on being the ring-bearer and had walked down the aisle with the kind of solemn concentration only a 2-year-old could manage. Silas didn't come. His empire had collapsed after the custody trial exposed the extent of his manipulation. He'd retreated somewhere, nursing his grudges and his wounded pride. Victoria felt nothing about his absence except a quiet gratitude that he was far away from them. When Dominic saw Victoria in her gold dress, his expression shifted into something that looked almost like regret. She understood what that was about. It was the regret of everything he could have done differently. Every time he could have chosen kindness over control. Every moment he'd wasted breaking what he could have simply cherished. "Beautiful," he said, taking her hand. "I'm terrified," she admitted, because she'd learned that honesty was the only thing that worked between them. "Of marrying me. Of believing this is real. Of believing I can trust you. Of believing that people actually change." Dominic squeezed her hand gently. "You don't have to believe in me. You just have to believe in us. In what we're building together. I can earn that every single day for the rest of our lives." The ceremony itself was brief. Victoria said her vows while looking at her son, understanding that this marriage wasn't just about 2 people. It was about creating a family structure where Owen would grow up learning that love didn't mean control, that commitment didn't require surrender, that 2 people could choose each other every single day without destroying each other in the process. Dominic said his vows with his eyes on Victoria, and she heard the truth in every word. Not because he was a good liar, he'd always been an excellent liar, but because she'd learned to hear the difference between manipulation and sincerity. And this was sincerity. This was a man who understood what he'd almost destroyed and was committing himself to never making that mistake again. 3 years later, Victoria's art studio had expanded into 3 locations. She'd trained a staff of facilitators who worked with women every single day, helping them transform their trauma into creation. Owen was in preschool, thriving, the kind of child who hugged his mother every morning without hesitation and hugged his father every evening with the same uncomplicated affection. Dominic had reformed his company. He'd stepped back from the predatory lending practices that had built his empire. He'd redirected his business toward renewable energy and fair lending, the kind of work that made less money but generated a different kind of wealth, the kind that let him sleep at night. They'd moved to a house in Connecticut with a studio where Victoria could paint, and a garden where Owen could play, and a kitchen where Dominic had learned to cook, because he'd realized that providing for people you loved meant more than just money. It meant presence. It meant showing up. On their 3-year anniversary, Victoria finished a painting. It was a self-portrait, but not of who she'd been. It was who she'd become. A woman strong enough to be vulnerable. A woman broken enough to understand that everyone carried damage, but choosing to love anyway. A woman who'd learned that sometimes your enemy becomes your answer, not because the damage between you disappears, but because you both commit to building something new on top of the wreckage. She hung it in the main room of the nonprofit, where new women could see it and understand that redemption wasn't a destination. It was a choice you made every single day. Dominic found her standing in front of the painting, his arms sliding around her waist in a gesture that had become second nature. He never held her like he owned her anymore. He held her like he was grateful, like she was a gift he hadn't earned and never would, but had decided to spend his life appreciating anyway. "You're happy," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm learning to be," Victoria replied. "Is that the same thing?" "It's better," he said, "because learning to be happy means you understand how fragile it is. It means you won't take it for granted." Owen burst through the door of the art studio, covered in paint, laughing about nothing in particular. He threw himself at both of them, and they caught him between them, this child who'd been born from control and raised in freedom, who'd never known what it meant to be owned because his parents had learned to let each other go enough to truly hold on. This was what redemption looked like. Not erasing the past, not forgiveness that erased the damage, but 2 people who understood exactly what they were capable of and chose, every single day, to be better. This was what second chances looked like when both people showed up to do the work. This was what love could become when you stopped trying to control it and started simply choosing it, moment by moment, breath by breath, for as long as you both shall live.